To make you want me, I can fabricate the truth. I'll give you easy, it'll keep me destitute. You hang me up on the line, hang me out to...
John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidency was in between a transformation in American policy between the presidencies of Dwight David Eisenhower and Lyndon Baines Johnson. The change's benefit is most evident in economic policy, specifically taxes and the federal approach to poverty, and social policy in relation to turning points in the civil rights movement. However, the change was for the worse in foreign policy concerning the Cold War and Vietnam War. Soon after his election, as he had promised, Dwight Eisenhower traveled to Korea to negotiate with Communist China and end the Korean War. It was one of the last victories for containment. After Wisconsin Senator McCarthy's Red Scare, Eisenhower and the Republican Party sought more than containment. They wanted to roll back communism completely. Under the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1957, the United States promised economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern nation threatened by communism. Americans feared the possibility of communists gaining the oil of the Middle East. They began to finance plans for an air force outfitted with nuclear weaponry to check the spread of power of the Soviet Union in China. Khrushchev was in power when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2, the first artificial satellites. The innovation of the Soviet Union spread rocket fever in the United States. Striving to outdo the East, Eisenhower instituted the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to work on sending an American satellite, which cost billions of dollars in plans and experiments into space. Nuclear research and development continued ceaselessly. The Soviet Union repeatedly tried to negotiate for disarmament, such as at Camp David in Maryland. But right before a Paris conference in May of 1960, irresolvable differences and an unwarranted American U-2 spy plane in Russia destroyed hopes of negotiation. Eisenhower's competitive efforts for containment proved unsuccessful and costly. Kennedy's approach to the Cold War was to protect the United States and its allies in Latin America. John Kennedy had handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the Soviet Union had placed nuclear weapons on Cuban bases.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world.
Kennedy called the storage on Cuba a provocative threat to world peace, and his distrust of dictator Fidel Castro resulted in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The 1,400 Cuban exiles who made up the invading force were killed or captured. Kennedy saw the spread of communism as an attempt for world domination and was determined to stop it. Kennedy's stand on protecting the whole of the Western Hemisphere served as an appeal to Latin America. His speech against communism was an attempt, using propaganda, to cement U.S. relations with the Latin American nations.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. More details just arrived. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no," the motorcade sped on. United Press says that the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal. Repeating, President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details.
John Kennedy was assassinated at a critical time during the Cold War. After his death, American strategy for the Cold War took on Johnson's ideas. Lyndon Johnson used further manipulation in his foreign policy. In the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, lawmakers virtually abdicated their war-declaring powers and handed the president a blank check to use further force in Southeast Asia. So when he was elected, Johnson would have fundamentally complete control over American participation in the Vietnam War. He, for the first time, ordered attacking U.S. troops to land and initiated Operation Rolling Thunder, a series of full-scale bombing attacks against North Vietnam. Whereas Eisenhower's methods had little effect, Lyndon Johnson single-handedly escalated the conflict in Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, from 1954 to 1970, Eisenhower utilized the domino theory. Kennedy depended on public support and flexible response, and Johnson stressed Americanizing the war. Eisenhower's administration justified the Vietnam War by claiming communism always had a domino effect, spreading from one place to the next. For the sake of freedom by containment, the United States had to intervene. Instead of signing the Geneva Accords to split Vietnam in half, one side communist and the other autocratic, Eisenhower promised economic and military aid to the autocratic Diem regime of South Vietnam. John Kennedy used flexible response to regulate distribution of troops and American power. Flexible response is developing an array of military options that can be precisely matched to the gravity of the crisis at hand. This was a gateway to Americanization of the war. Johnson's Americanization of the Vietnam War was defined by troops, motivation, and warfare. The number of American troops stationed in Vietnam was at its highest during Johnson's first term and Americanization. By early 1968, the brutal and futile struggle had become the longest and most unpopular foreign war in the nation's history. In approaching taxes and poverty, Johnson's plan of the Great Society was more effective than Kennedy's New Frontier or Eisenhower's modern republicanism. Dwight Eisenhower's modern republicanism preserved individual freedom and the market economy, yet ensured that government would provide necessary assistance to workers who had lost their jobs or to senior citizens. Eisenhower had a balanced plan to be liberal when it came to people and to be conservative when it came to government and economy. He wanted to protect America from what he called creeping socialism. He limited expensive growth of the military, promoted state ownership of oil reserves, and encouraged industrial competition. Eisenhower also addressed immigration and Native Americans with controversial systems. In Operation Wetback, he deported up to 1 million Mexican immigrants in response to the Mexican government's worries that illegal Mexican immigration to the United States would undercut the Vaquero program of legally imported farm workers, inaugurated during World War II. Eisenhower canceled the Indian New Deal by taking tribes' legal status and readopting assimilation as attempted through the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which took tribal lands and forced Native American assimilation. Kennedy's New Frontier promoted increases in medical care for the elderly and federal funding for education. Kennedy wanted to heal the economy from Eisenhower-era recessions by compromising wages and prices in the steel industry. He also attempted to stimulate American economy by lowering taxes and exploring the possibilities of traveling into space. Kennedy ended a period of tight fiscal policies, loosening monetary policy to keep interest rates down and encourage growth of the economy. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society included the war on poverty and the Big Four, aid to education, medical care for the elderly and indigent, immigration reform, and a new voting rights bill. Johnson's reforms were his own ambitions incorporated into the plans Kennedy never had the chance to carry out. Through the Great Society, the Office of Economic Opportunity received $2 billion to continue self-help programs like Job Corps and the Community Action Program for the financially needy. The Big Four gave financial aid to students rather than schools, provided Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor, and created the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that abolished the national origins quota system from the previous century, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that reformed voting for African Americans. The Civil Rights Movement experienced a jumpstart during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency that was never present during the terms of Kennedy and Eisenhower. Eisenhower, having grown up in an all-white town, spent his career in a segregated army, and advised against integration of the armed forces in 1948, was slow to advocate integration. He resented the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in the public schools was inherently unequal and thus unconstitutional. Though he mobilized federal troops to ensure that 9 African American students were enrolled in Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, he actually did little to promote integration in schools. When he left the White House, only 6% of African American students attended integrated schools. More effectively, Dwight Eisenhower supported the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction, which set up federal protection of voting rights that had been violated by literacy tests, poll taxes, and sheer intimidation. During Kennedy's presidency, efforts for integration and complete equality progressed slowly. The boldest action that joined the Kennedy administration to the Civil Rights Movement was the dispatch of federal protection for the Freedom Riders after they were attacked in Alabama in May of 1961. Alabama proved to be a hotbed of racial agitation as the most segregated big city in America. Previous attempts to crack the city's rigid racial barriers had produced more than 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks since 1957. There were also the attack dogs, electric cattle prods, and hoses with enormous water pressure pointed directly at demonstrators and protesters. On June 11th of 1963, Kennedy delivered a televised speech that called the civil rights issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Under Lyndon B. Johnson, the civil rights movement finally reached the peak it was headed toward while Kennedy was in office. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government more muscle to enforce school desegregation orders and prohibit racial discrimination in all kinds of public accommodations and employment. Ratified in January of 1964, the 24th Amendment did away with the poll tax, a voter's fee that many African Americans could not pay. With the Voting Rights Act of 1965, literacy tests, reading tests to qualify voters were banned, and federal registrars were sent into southern states. African Americans in the South achieved their right to vote freely and without unlawful punishment. Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had significantly different approaches to economic, social, and foreign affairs during their presidencies. Eisenhower's sensationalist participation in the Cold War introduced new ways of thought in America. However, his New Deal policy proved to be erratic and unnecessary. Kennedy's reforms did better, but not best. His appeals to Latin America and sporadic efforts for civil rights and integration were helpful, yet inadequate. Lyndon Johnson was a redeemer in American economy and civil rights. Under his presidency, superior social reforms, were achieved for both the poor and the colored. Unfortunately, Johnson did not prove himself to be more competent than Eisenhower and Kennedy in the Cold War. His Americanization of the Vietnam War destroyed the morale of many Americans and cost several lives.